I'm so glad that Allison invited me to read today. It's very kind of her to do that. And this chapter is that we're doing today, sleigh bells, and the next chapter are really fun. So this is really where the in these happy golden years is really where the Laura and Almanzo story comes together, and this story was the reason that I was invited to join the cast of Little House. So because of that, this book has great personal brings great personal pleasure for me, and I love getting the chance to read it. So thank you for that. And so everyone's saying hi to everybody here. Very cool. I hope you've all been having fun. Hope everyone is well. I think the last time I read to you at the end of the long winter, it seems like numbers were trending downward related to the whole COVID-19 situation that we're dealing with as a country and the world. The numbers were trending downward in the U.S. and now they're moving upward again. And so, we're right back in this thing. Well, we never left it, but it's become more serious again. So I hope people are taking care of themselves and taking care of those they love and care about, being respectful of everyone's health. Very important, very important. And I get that this is a hot button issue for a lot of people. I'm choosing to focus on the science and not focus on, in regards to this, I'm choosing to focus on the science and not on the other issues that swirl around this. I just think that is there's more clarity in that. There's more clarity in the science, and I think we can, if we choose to pay attention to it, it can be helpful to us. So there we go. I'm going to leave it at that. It's time to read Sleigh Bells. So on we on we go. I brought out Christmas sleigh bells for this. Clarence dashed outdoors and back again, shouting, "It's someone for you, teacher." Laura was helping Ruby into her coat. "Tell him I will be there in a minute." "Come on, Charles, you ought to see his horses." Clarence slammed the door so that the shanty shook. Laura quickly put on her coat and tied her hood and muffler. She shut the stove's drafts, thrust her hands into her mittens, and took her books and dinner pail. She made sure the door was fastened behind her. All the time she was so excited that she could hardly breathe. Pa had not come, but she was going home after all. Almanzo Wilder was sitting in a cutter so low and small that it was hardly more than a heap of furs on the snow behind Prince and Lady. He was muffled in a buffalo coat. And a fur cap with flaps that was as snug as a hood. He did not step out into the storm. Instead, he lifted the fur robes and gave Laura his hand to help her step into the cutter. Then he tucked the robes around her. They were furry, warm buffalo skins lined with flannel. "You want to stop at Brewster's?" he asked. "I must, to leave the dinner pail and get my satchel," Laura said. In the Brewster house, Johnny was screaming angrily, and when Laura came out of the house, she saw Almanzo looking at it with disgust. But it was all behind her now. She was going home. Almanzo tucked the robes snugly around her. The sleigh bells began merrily ringing, and swiftly behind the brown horses, she was going home. I just want to make sure that I've got this muted here. She said through her thick black woolen veil, "It's nice of you to come for me. I was hoping Pa would come." Almanzo hesitated. "Well, He was figuring he would, but I told him it's a drive that would be pretty hard on his team. Well, they'll have to bring me back, Laura said doubtfully. I must be at school Monday morning. Well, maybe Prince and Lady could make the drive again, Almanzo said. Laura was embarrassed. She had not meant to hint. She had not even thought of his bringing her back. Again, she had spoken before she thought. How right Pa's advice had been. She should always think before she spoke. She thought, well, after this, I shall always think before I speak. And she said, without thinking how rude it would sound, oh, you needn't bother. Pa will bring me back. It would be no bother, Almanzo said. I told you I'd take you for a sleigh ride when I got my cutter made. This is the cutter. How do you like it? I think it's fun to ride in. It's so little, Laura answered. I made it smaller than the bottom ones. It's only 5 feet long and 26 inches wide at the bottom. Makes it snugger to ride in and lighter for the horses to pull, Almanzo explained. They hardly know they're pulling anything. It's like flying, Laura said. She had never imagined such wonderful speed. The low clouds raced backward overhead. The blown snow smoked backward on either side, and swiftly onward went the glossy brown horses, streaming music from their string of bells. There was not a jolt or a jar. The little cutter skimmed the snow as smoothly as a bird in air. Here's the picture of them riding along in the cutter. Almost too soon, though not soon enough, they were flashing past the windows of Main Street, and here was Pa's front door again, opening, and Pa standing in it. Laura was out of the cutter and up the steps before she thought, oh, thank you, Mr. Wilder, good night. She called back, all in a breath, and she was at home. Ma's smile lighted her whole face. Carrie came running to unwind Laura's muffler and veil, while Grace clapped her hands and shouted, Laura's come home! Then Pa came in and said, let's look at you, Flutter. Let's look at you. Well, the same little flutter budget. There was so much to say and to tell. The big sitting room had never looked so beautiful. The walls were dark brown now. Every year the pine boards grew darker. The table was covered with the red checked cloth, and the braided rag rugs were gay on the floor. The rocking chairs stood by the white curtained windows, Mary's boughten chair and the willow chair that Pa had made for Ma so long ago in the Indian Territory. The patchwork cushions were in them, and there was Ma's work basket and her knitting with the needles thrust into the ball of yarn. Kitty lazily stretched and yawned and came to curve, purring against Laura's ankles. There on Pa's desk was the blue bead basket that that Mary had made. The talking went on at the supper table. Laura was more hungry for talk than for food. She told about each one of her pupils at school, and Ma told of Mary's latest letter. Mary was doing so well in the College for the Blind in Iowa. Carrie told all the news of the school in town. Grace told of the words she had learned to read and of Kitty's last fight with the dog. After supper, when Laura and Carrie had done the dishes, Pa said, as Laura had been hoping he would, if you bring me the fiddle, Laura, we'll have a little music. He played the brave marching songs of Scotland and of the United States. He played the sweet old love songs and the gay dance tunes, and Laura was so happy that her throat ached. When it was bedtime and she went upstairs with Carrie and Grace, she looked from the attic window at the lights of the town twinkling here and there through the wind and the blowing snow. As she snuggled under the quilt, she heard Pa and Ma come up to their room at the head of the stairs. She heard Ma's pleasant low voice and Pa's deeper one answering it, and she was so glad to be home for 2 nights and nearly 2 days that she could hardly go to sleep. Even her sleep was deep and good without fear of falling off a narrow sofa. Almost at once, it seemed her eyes opened. She heard the stove lid rattle downstairs, and she knew that she was at home. "Good morning," Carrie said from her bed, and Grace bounced up and cried, "Good morning, Laura." "Good morning." Ma smiled when Laura entered the kitchen, and Pa came in with the milk and said, "Good morning, Flutterbudget." And Laura had never noticed before that saying good morning made the morning good. Anyway, she was learning something from that Mrs. Brewster, she thought. Breakfast was so pleasant. Then briskly and still talking, Laura and Carrie did the dishes and went upstairs to make the beds. While they were tucking in a sheet, Laura said, "Carrie, do you ever think how lucky we are to have a home like this?" Carrie looked around her, surprised. There was nothing to be seen but the 2 beds, the 3 boxes under the eaves where they kept their things, and the underside of the shingles overhead. There was also the stovepipe that came up through the floor and went out through the roof. "It is snug," Carrie said, while they spread the first quilt and folded and tucked its corners. "I guess I never did think exactly." "Well, you wait till you go away," Laura said. "Then you'll think." "Do you dreadfully hate to teach school?" Carrie asked her, low. "Yes, I do," Laura almost whispered. "But Pa and Ma mustn't know." They plumped up the pillows and set them in their places and went to Laura's bed. "Maybe it won't have too long," Carrie consoled her. They unbuttoned the straw tick and thrust their arms deep into it, stirring the straw. "Maybe you'll get married. Ma did." "I don't want to," Laura said. She patted the tick smooth and buttoned it. "There. Now the bottom quilt. I'd rather stay home than anything." "Always?" Carrie asked. "Yes, always," Laura said, and she meant it with her heart. She spread the sheet. "But I can't. Not all the time. I have to go on teaching school." They tucked in the quilts and plumped up Laura's pillow. The beds were done. Carrie said she would do all the sweeping. "I always do now," she said. "And if you're going to Mary Powers, the sooner you go, the sooner you'll be back." "I only have to find out if I'm keeping up with my classes," Laura said. Downstairs, she set the wash boiler on the stove and filled it with pails of water from the well. Then, while it was heating, she went to see Mary Power. She had quite forgotten that she had ever disliked the town. It was bright and brisk this morning. Sunlight glinted on the icy ruts of snow in the street and sparkled on the frosty edges of the board sidewalk. In the 2 blocks, there were only 2 vacant lots on the west side of the street now, and some of the stores were painted white or gray. Hawthorne's grocery was painted red. Everywhere there was the stir and bustle of the morning. The storekeepers in thick coats and caps were scraping trodden bits of snow from the sidewalk before their stores and talking and joking as they worked. Doors slammed, hens cackled, and horses whinnied in the stables. Mr. Fuller and then Mr. Bradley lifted their caps and said good morning to Laura as she passed. Mr. Bradley said, "I hear you're teaching Brewster School, Miss Ingalls." Laura felt very grown up. "Yes," she said, "I'm in town only over Saturday." "Well, I wish you all success," said Mr. Bradley. "Thank you, Mr. Bradley," said Laura. In Mr. Power's tailor shop, Mary's father sat cross-legged on his table, sewing busily. Mary was helping her mother with the morning's work in the back room. "Well, look who's here," Mrs. Power exclaimed. "How's the school teacher?" "Very well, thank you," said Laura. "Do you like teaching school?" Mary wanted to know. "I'm getting along all right, I guess," Laura said, "but I'd rather be home. I'll be glad when the 2 months are over." "So will all of us," Mary told her. "My, we miss you at school." Laura was pleased. "Do you?" she said. "I miss you too." "Nellie Olson tried to get your seat," Mary went on, "but Ida wouldn't let her. Ida says she's keeping that seat for you till you come back, and Mr. Owen said she can." "Whatever did Nellie Olson want my seat for?" Laura exclaimed. Hers was just as good, or almost. Well, that's Nellie for you, said Mary. She just wants anything that anybody else has, that's all. Oh, Laura, she'll be fit to be tied when I tell her that Almanzo Wilder brought you home in his new cutter. They both laughed. Laura felt a little ashamed, but she couldn't help laughing. They remembered Nellie's bragging that she was going to ride behind those brown horses, and she'd never had done it yet. I could hardly wait, Mary said. Mrs. Power said, I don't think that's very nice, Mary. I know it isn't, Mary admitted. But if you knew how that Nellie Olson's always bragging and showing off and picking on Laura, and now to think that Laura's teaching school and Almanzo Wilder's beauing her home. Oh, no, he isn't, Laura cried out. It isn't like that at all. He came for me as a favor to Pa. Mary laughed. He must think a lot of your Pa. She began to tease, and then she looked at Laura and said, I'm sorry, I won't talk about it if you don't want to. Well, I don't mean that, Laura said. Everything is simple when you're alone or at home, but as soon as you meet other people, you are in difficulties. I just don't want you to think Mr. Wilder's my beau, because he isn't. All right, Mary said. And I only ran in for a minute, Laura explained. I put wash water on, and it must be hot now. Tell me where you are in your lessons, Mary. When Mary told her, Laura saw that she was keeping up with the class by her studying at night. Then she went home. All that day was such a happy time. Laura did her washing and sprinkled and ironed the clean, fresh clothes. Then in the cozy sitting room, she ripped her beautiful brown velvet hat, talking all the time with Ma and Carrie and Grace. She brushed and steamed the velvet and draped it again over the buckram frame and tied it on. It looked like a new hat, even more becoming than before. There was just enough time to brush and sponge and press her brown dress, and then to help Ma get an early supper. Afterward, they all bathed one by one in the warm kitchen and went to bed. If I could only live like this always, I'd never want anything more, Laura thought as she went to sleep. But maybe I appreciate it more now because I have only tonight and tomorrow morning. The morning sunshine and the sky had their quiet Sunday look, and the town was quiet with a Sunday stillness when Laura and Carrie and Grace and Ma sedately went out on Sunday morning. The morning work was done. The beans for Sunday dinner were baking slowly in the oven. Pa carefully closed the heating stove's drafts and came out and locked the door. Laura and Carrie went ahead. Pa and Ma came behind them, holding Grace's hands, all fresh and clean and dressed in Sunday best. They walked slowly in the cold Sunday morning, taking care not to slip on the icy paths. Carefully along the street and single file across lots behind Fuller's store, everyone else was going toward the church too. As she went in, Laura looked eagerly over the partly filled seats, and there was Ida. Ida's brown eyes danced when she saw Laura, and she slid along the seat to make room and gave Laura's arm a squeeze. "My, I'm glad to see you," she whispered. "When did you come?" "Friday after school. I've got to go back this afternoon," Laura answered. There was a little time to talk before Sunday school. "Do you like teaching?" Ida asked. "No, I do not. But don't tell anybody else. I'm getting along all right so far." "Well, I won't," Ida promised. "I knew you would, but your place at school is awfully empty." That's interesting. I'm just looking at this. "Do you like teaching?" "No, I do not. But don't tell anybody else. I'm getting along all right so far." "Okay, Ida, I won't," Ida promised. "I knew you would get along all right. But your place at school is awfully empty." "I'll be back. It's only 7 weeks more," Laura said. "Laura," Ida said, "you don't care if Nellie Olson sits with me while you're gone, do you?" "Why, Laura began. Then she saw that Ida was only teasing. "Of course not," she said. "You ask her and see if she will." Because they were in church and could not laugh, they sat silently shaking and almost choking in their effort to keep their faces sober. Lawyer Barnes was rapping the pulpit to bring the Sunday school to order, and they could not talk any more. They must rise and join in the singing. Sweet Sabbath school, more dear to me than fairest palace dome, my heart turns with joy to thee, my own dear Sabbath home. Singing together was even better than talking. Ida was such a dear, Laura thought, and as they stood side by side, holding the hymn book open before them. Here first my wilful wandering heart the way of life was shown. Here first I sought the better part and gained a Sabbath home. Clear and sure, Laura's voice held the note while Ida's soft alto chimed Sabbath home. Then their voices blended again. My heart turns with joy to thee, my own dear Sabbath home. Sunday school was the pleasant part of church. Though they could talk only to the teacher about the lesson, Ida and Laura could smile at each other and sing together. And when Sunday school ended, there was only time to say, goodbye, goodbye. Then Ida must sit with Mrs. Brown in the front seat while Reverend Brown preached one of his long, stupid sermons. Laura and Carrie went to sit with Pa and Ma and Grace. Laura made sure that she remembered the text to repeat at home when Pa asked her. Then she need not listen any more. She always missed Mary in church. Mary had always sat so properly beside her, watchful that Laura behaved. It was strange to think that they had been little girls, and now Mary was in college and Laura was a school teacher. She tried not to think of Mrs. Brewster's in the school. After all, Mary had gone to college, and now Laura was earning $40. With $40, Mary could surely stay in college next year. Maybe everything comes out all right if you keep on trying. Anyway, you have to keep on trying. Nothing will come out right if you don't. If I can only manage Clarence for 7 more weeks, Laura thought. Carrie pinched her arm. Everyone was standing up to sing the doxology. Church was over. Dinner was so good. Ma's baked beans were delicious, and the bread and butter and little cucumber pickles, and everyone was so comfortable, so cheerful and talking. Laura said, "Oh, I do like it here." "Well, it's too bad that Brewster's isn't a better place to stay," said Pa. "Why, Pa, I haven't complained," Laura said in surprise. "I know you haven't," said Pa. "Well, keep a stiff upper lip. 7 weeks will soon be gone and you'll be home again." How pleasant it was after the dishes were done, when they were all settled in the front room for Sunday afternoon. Sunshine streamed in through the clean windows into the warm room where Ma sat gently rocking, and Carrie and Grace pored over pictures in Pa's big green book, The Wonders of the Animal World. Pa read items from the Pioneer Press to Ma, and at his desk Laura sat writing a letter to Mary, carefully with Ma's little pearl-handled pen that was shaped like a feather. She wrote of her school and of her pupils. Of course, she wrote of nothing unpleasant. The clock ticked, and now and then Kitty lazily stretched and purred a short purr. When the letter was finished, Laura went upstairs and packed her clean clothes in Ma's satchel. She brought it downstairs and into the front room. It must be time to go. But Pa sat reading his paper and took no notice. Ma looked at the clock and gently, "Charles, surely you must hitch up or you'll be late starting. It's a long way to go and come, and dark comes early nowadays." Pa only turned a page of the paper and said, "There's no hurry." Laura and Ma looked at each other in amazement. They looked at the clock and again at Pa. He did not stir, but his brown beard had a smiling look. Laura sat down. The clock ticked and Pa silently read the paper. Twice Ma almost spoke and changed her mind, and at last, not looking up, Pa said, "Some folks worry about my team." "Why, Charles, there isn't anything wrong with the horses," Ma exclaimed. "Well, said Pa. They're not as young as they used to be for a fact, and they can still hold out pretty well, though for 12 miles and back. Charles, Ma said helplessly. Pa looked up at Laura, and his eyes were twinkling. Maybe I don't have to drive them so far, he said. Sleigh bells were coming down the street. Clearer and louder they came, then rang all at once and stopped by the door. Pa went to the door and opened it. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ingalls," Laura heard Almanzo Wilder say. "I stopped by to see if Laura would let me drive her out to her school." "Why, I'm sure she'd like a ride in that cutter," Pa replied. "Well, it's getting late and too cold to tie him without blanketing," Almanzo said. "I'll drive him down the street and stop on my way back." "I'll tell her," Pa answered, and shut the door while the bells jingled away. "How about it, Laura?" "Well, it is fun to ride in a cutter," Laura said. Quickly she tied on her hood and got into her coat. The bells were coming, and she hardly had time to say goodbye before they stopped at the door. "Don't forget the satchel," Ma said, and Laura turned back to snap it up. "Thank you, Ma. Goodbye," she said, and went out to the cutter. Almanzo helped her in and tucked the robes around her. Prince and lady started quickly. All the bells rang out their music, and she was on her way back to her school. The next chapter, Stiff Upper Lip. All that week, everything went wrong. Everything. Nothing gave Laura the least encouragement. The weather was sullen. Dull clouds lay low and flat above the gray-white prairie, and the wind blew monotonously. The cold was damp and clammy. The stove smoked. Mrs. Brewster let the housework go. She did not sweep out the snow that Mr. Brewster tracked in. It melted and made puddles with the ashes around the stove. She did not make their bed or even spread it up. Twice a day she cooked potatoes and salt pork and put them on the table. The rest of the time she sat brooding. She did not even comb her hair, and it seemed to Laura that Johnny squalled with temper that whole week. Once Laura tried to play with him, but he only struck her, and Mrs. Brewster said angrily, "Leave him alone." After supper, he went to sleep on his father's knee, and Mr. Brewster just sat. The air seemed to smolder with Mrs. Brewster's silence, and he sat, Laura thought, like a bump on a log. She had heard that said, but she had not realized what it meant. A bump on a log does not fight anyone, but it cannot be budged. The silence was so loud that Laura could hardly study. When she went to bed, Mrs. Brewster quarreled at Mr. Brewster. She wanted to go back east. Laura could hardly have studied well anyway. She was so worried about her school. In spite of all she could do, everything went from bad to worse. It began on Monday when Tommy did not know one word of his spelling lesson. Ruby would not let him have the speller, he said. "Why, Ruby?" Laura said in surprise. Then sweet little Ruby turned into a very spitfire. Laura was so startled that before she could stop them, Ruby and Tommy were quarreling. Sternly, Laura stopped that. She went to Tommy's seat and gave him the speller. "Now learn that lesson," she said. "You may stay in at recess to recite it to me." Next day, Ruby did not know her lesson. She stood before Laura, with her hands behind her, innocent as a kitten, and said, "I could not learn it, teacher. You gave Tommy the speller." Laura remembered to count 10. Then she said, "So I did. Well, you and Tommy may sit together to learn your spelling." They were not studying the same lessons in the book, but they could hold it open in two places. Leaning to one side, Tommy could study his lesson, while Ruby, leaning to the other side, could study hers. In that way, Laura and Mary used to learn their different lessons in Ma's speller, but Tommy and Ruby did not. They sat silently, struggling, each to open the book wider at his place. Again and again, Laura said sharply, "Tommy, Ruby? But neither of them learned their spelling well. Martha could not work her arithmetic problems. Charles sat idly staring at the window, where nothing was to be seen but the gray weather. When Laura told him to keep his eyes on his lessons, he stared, daydreaming at a page. Laura knew that he was not seeing it. She was too little. When Martha and Charles and Clarence stood before her to recite, they were too much for her, though she did her best. She could not interest them in learning even geography and history. On Monday, Clarence knew part of his history lesson, but when Laura asked him when the first settlement was made in Virginia, he answered carelessly, "No, I didn't study that part." "Why didn't you?" Laura asked. "The lesson was too long," Clarence replied, with a look from narrow, laughing eyes that said, "What are you going to do about that?" Laura was furiously angry, but as her eyes met his, she knew that he expected her to be angry. What could she do? She could not punish him. He was too big. She must not show any anger. So she kept quiet while she turned the pages of the history consideringly. Her heart was faint, but she must not let him know that. Finally, she said, "Well, it is too bad that you did not learn this. It will make your next lesson so much longer, for we must not keep Charles and Martha back." She went on hearing Charles and Martha recite the lesson. Then she gave them another lesson of the usual length. The next day, Clarence did not know his history at all. "It's no use trying to learn such long lessons," he said. "If you do not learn, Clarence, you are the loser," Laura told him. She kept on asking him questions in his turn, hoping that he would grow ashamed of answering, "I don't know," but he did not. Every day she felt more miserably that she was failing. She could not teach school. Her first school would be a failure. She would not be able to get another certificate. She would earn no more money. Mary would have to leave college, and that would be Laura's fault. She could hardly learn her own lessons, though she studied them not only at night, but at noon and recess. When she went back to town, she would be behind her class. All the trouble came from Clarence. He could make Ruby and Tommy behave if he would, but he was their older brother. He could learn his lessons. He was much smarter than Martha and Charles. How she wished she were big enough to give Clarence the whipping he deserved. Slowly the week dragged by, the longest and most miserable week that Laura had ever known. On Thursday, when Laura said, "Third arithmetic class, rise," Clarence stood up quickly and Charles began to move languidly. But Martha half rose and yelled, "Ow!" and sat down as if she were jerked. Clarence had driven his knife through her braid and pinned it to his desk. He had done it so quietly that Martha knew nothing of it until she tried to stand up. "Clarence," Laura said. He did not stop laughing. Tommy was laughing. Ruby was giggling. Even Charles was grinning. Martha sat, red-faced, with tears in her eyes. Laura was in despair. They were all against her. She could not discipline. Oh, how could they be so mean? For an instant, she remembered Miss Wilder, who had failed to teach the school in town. This was the way she felt. Laura thought. Here we go. Here's the picture of the misbehaving students. I remember when we were all kids, many years ago for some of us, and there would be a new teacher or a substitute teacher, and kids would test them. Kids can be tough, and they know that there's only so much that the teacher can do to change the dynamic. And Laura, of course, being one of them, being their contemporaries, really hard for her to step in and get them to do what they needed to do. So we saw the picture of Laura looking at her students misbehaving. Then suddenly she was very angry. She yanked the knife up and clicked it shut in her fist. She did not feel small as she faced Charles. "Shame on you," she said, and he stopped laughing. They were all still. Laura marched back to her table and rapped on it. "Third class in arithmetic, rise, come forward." They did not know the lesson. They could not solve the problems, but at least they went through the motions of trying. Laura felt tall and terrible, and they obeyed her meekly. At last she said, "You may all repeat this lesson tomorrow. Class is dismissed." Her head ached as she went toward Mrs. Brewster's hateful house. She could not be angry all the time, and discipline was no good if the pupils would not learn their lessons. Ruby and Tommy were far behind in spelling. Martha could not parse a simple compound sentence, nor add fractions, and Clarence was learning no history. Laura tried to hope that she could do better tomorrow. Friday was quiet. Everyone was dull and listless. They were only waiting for the week to end, so was she. The hands of the clock had never moved so slowly. In the afternoon, the clouds began to break, and the light grew brighter. Just before 4 o'clock, pale sunshine streamed eastward across the snowy land, and Laura heard sleigh bells faintly ringing. "You may put away your books," she said. That miserable week was ended at last. Nothing more could happen now. "School is dismissed." The music of the bells came ringing louder and clearer. Laura's coat was buttoned and her hood tied when Prince and Lady passed the window with the dancing bells. She snatched up her books and dinner pail, and then the worst thing of all happened. Clarence opened the door, thrust his head in, and shouted, "Teacher's Beau's here!" Almanzo Wilder must have heard. He could not help hearing. Laura did not know how she could face him. What could she say? How could she tell him that she had given Clarence no reason to say such a thing? He was waiting in the cold wind, and the horses were blanketed. She must go out. It seemed to her that he was smiling, but she could hardly look at him. He tucked her in and said, "Y'all snug?" "Yes, thank you," she answered. The horses went swiftly, their string of bells merrily ringing. It would be better to say nothing of Clarence, Laura decided. As Ma would say, least said, soonest mended. And that's the end of that chapter. Fun. Laura's struggling, but on the other side of her life, things are happening. I have to say this will, in all likelihood, be the last reading that I do with you of this reading of the books. I think unless Allison reaches out to me and asks for another day, I don't know. Every now and then she needs a helping hand with the reading, and I'm glad to step in. But I have to say that Allison has done a spectacular job with this, starting in March, uninterrupted, 7 days a week. She's worked it out so that the books would be read every day on her Facebook page, and so many of you have been here. This group has been amazing, and logging in every day and clicking on to hear the Little House stories, and it's just been a joy. It's really been a joy to do it, and Allison will finish it with aplomb. And I don't know if she's actually going to go on and read the first 4 years, which is a very different book in its character, but we'll see. In the meantime, I've had fun. Have a great day. Take care of yourselves. Wash your hands. Wear your masks when you're out in public. Watch your social distancing. Be careful. Take care of each other. This is a really important time for all of us, for our country, to be careful and to be smart about what we're doing. So, all the best, and I'll see you again. I know I'll see you all again at some point, hopefully sooner than later. Take care. Bye.